I was having a look recently in my back catalogue of Inside the Chieftain's Hatch videos, and there's like 40 or 50 of them so far. But you may have noticed that it's one very significant vehicle I haven't covered yet. And it's a Sherman type. I've already covered an M4A1, an early version, but everybody's favourite always seems to be the late model Sherman. I thought it was about time we fixed that omission. So behold, the M4 76mm HVSS, one of the last of the breed. Now this particular vehicle is an M4A2 76 HVSS, and it is found at the Canadian Tank Museum. It's a little bit east of Toronto if you're going that way. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the tour of what has sometimes been known as the ultimate Sherman. The M4 ran through a load of modifications during its production run, but the M4A2 76 HVSS, which is a heck of a mouthful, is a consolidation of at least 4 different major programs. Now, a lot of people will simply look at a 76 HVSS and say, it's an M4 Easy 8. Well, yes, it is, but that is only a small part of the story. The Easy 8 program was indeed the suspension, which we'll have a look at, of course, in a few minutes. But the gun was part of the Easy 6 program. Other changes, well, the wet stowage, very important, and that was applied to both 76 and 75 guns. And finally, the change to the front slope to make it easier to manufacture, which of course came with a couple of other side benefits. The M4A2 version of the 76 HVSS was one of the last to enter service. In fact, so late to enter service it was that the only combat use of this type of tank was by the Soviets in Manchuria against the Japanese. All the others were used in a post-war situation. Hence, we have a couple of survivors, such as this one in Canada. Very commonly, any tank with a 76 and HVSS is just called an Easy 8. This actually is not correct, and I suspect the reason that this was done is because the official terminology for this thing is a mouthful. And it's a lot easier on the old clickety typewriters to hit E and then 8 instead of writing either full with HVSS or 23-inch track, which you'll also sometimes see. In actuality, this tank is a combination of 4 different major upgrade programs, together with a bunch of other modifications and upgrades that were added throughout Sherman's production run. And I'm going to go over them all as we move around the tank. But for now, all you need to worry about is M4, i.e. Sherman, A2, twin diesel engine, 76mm, big gun, HVSS, suspension. Now, the purists can put a W in there for wet stowage, but it wasn't really necessary as all the 76s came with wet stowage by default. So that out of the way, again, I'll go into the background and details of all this because the programs really started in 1942 and this particular tank was built in early 45. But for now, we'll start as ever at the front of the vehicle and we'll work our way around and see what we talk about as we go. So one of the identifiers of a really late production M4 is the location of the lifting eye, which has been moved outwards, and they've also removed the wing mirrors that would be found ordinarily on both sides of the tank. 23-inch track we'll come back to, your typical headlight guard, low vis light, and you'll of course see the sandbags. So the museum uses this in reenactments and so on, so they kit it out as would be often seen. The sandbags were as near to useless as makes no difference. As the engineers said, don't do it, it just adds weight to the vehicle, it reduces reliability. However, the troops felt better and they figured, well, if they feel more confident, they'll fight better. And so a lot of units, the sandbags were not only authorized, but actually approved as an official modification. Some units had special racks built up for them and so on. Some commanders, notably Patton, and credit to him for this one, were adamant that this was a stupid idea and you shall not do it. And there's a very famous photo of Patton marching away from a unit that was assigned to him from another division. And he's looking not very happy, and the crew inside, who, as far as they knew, did absolutely nothing wrong, just got chewed out by an army commander. But anyway, there is indeed a caliber 30 bow mount under here. We'll go over it, and of course the famous comb, which we've covered elsewhere. It is a shipping lock. You use it to lock the brakes in position and allow you to release the brakes by attaching onto this. Has no function outside of shipping, but remember, this tank is all about shipping because it's built in the US and the fighting is not in the US. It's not even close to the US. Yeah, got to get it there. And of course, they thought about it. No, there's a whole slew more than just the brake lock. I mean, you got to waterproof the thing, and topic for another day. The front slope. So when they made one of the production modifications, and one of the four big things, the small hatch slope, which was 47 degrees, if I recall correctly, at 2 inches, it gave very good protection. The problem was that in order to leave room for the driver and the bow gunner, you had to make bulges. And that added a whole slew of additional welds you had to put onto the plate. Even on the cast versions, which you don't have the additional production problem, you still had a bit of a weak point in the nature of this bulge. And that's why you'd often have seen the vertical plates that were added afterwards. I believe the M4A1 I covered had those. So by angling the front plate forward, they allowed for the larger hatches, and of course now there it is just one single plate of rolled steel. So no production problems there. Of course, by increasing the angle of the plate, that reduces the angling effect of the 2 inches of armor. So to make up for it, to retain the same level of armor protection, they had to increase the thickness from 2 to 2.5 inches. As we move forward, of course, we have the splashboard. What we now have in the place of the earlier versions of transmission housing, this is a late model version, also known as a shark nose, simply because of the shape. More clevises for towing, and the horn, as you would. And of course, spare road wheels. You can never have too many road wheels, especially when you're doing a lot of cross-country work. What really wears down the road wheels isn't the terrain. Oftentimes rocks will come in and they'll start chewing away, but more often than not, what the real killer of the road wheels are the center guides. Again, we'll talk about suspension when we get to it. That's pretty much it for the front. Let's go around the side. As with all M4A2s, this is a welded hull vehicle. You can see the thickness of the front plate as it welds into the side. Side, of course, is completely vertical. Then, of course, you come down to the defining factor of an Easy 8 vehicle, and that is the suspension. Easy 8, why is it called Easy 8? That's the letter E in the phonetic alphabet of the US Army of the time. So some people would say it's because it's an easy ride. Well, it may very well have had an easy ride, and that's why it was selected. But it was, instead of Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta Echo, back then it was something like Abel Baker Charlie Dog Easy. And that's how you end up with Easy 8, because the E8 developmental program was for the HVSS. Now, HVSS did not start on the M4. Go look at an M6 heavy tank. It had HVSS, horizontal volute spring suspension. And it was also trialed on medium tanks on an M3 medium tank, just to check it out before they eventually settled on this. Now, there was a whole slew of modifications and attempts to improve the suspension on the M4. You had a torsion bar system, there was a Christie proposal, there was the Centipede, which is an absolutely hideous thing involving a couple of half-track bogies, or like 16 wheels per side. They ended up in the end, of course, going with the horizontal volute spring. So the volute spring itself is this component here, covered by mud. Actually, there's a clean one on the far side, we'll just inset it. But the spring in this case acts horizontally. You look at an earlier M4 or an M3, and the spring acts vertically, hence HVSS versus VVSS. Another difference is on the bogie, we now have a shock absorber. There's no shock absorber on a VVSS tank. Now, these bogies are, of course, completely interchangeable, right to left, which means that this housing is at the back on the left-hand side of the tank. And if you look at the right-hand side of the tank, you'll see the housing is forward. It's not a mirror image. Another major difference with the wider track is now we've gone from end connectors with guide horns to now center guides in the middle of the track, as you would find with a modern vehicle. And as such, also, we've now doubled the amount of road wheels. There's 4 per bogie now instead of the earlier 2. This all spreads the weight out a bit more and helps with one of the complaints of the earlier VVS design. Now, it wasn't that VVSS wasn't known to be inferior to a wider track, but it was a deliberate decision made to increase the speed of the vehicle. Because by adding the wider track and the new wheels, you've added an extra 1.5 tons to the vehicle just with the suspension. Now, the width of the suspension does mean you can go over softer ground, but it does mean that you have more resistance and more inertia to overcome when you simply drive that extra ton around each side. So you had to wait for more powerful engines before you really could go all in on the wider track. So eventually that's what they went with, is the HVSS. As you go up, you'll see the holes for the sand shields. Now, the sand shields were theoretically fitted. You'll find a couple of prototypes mainly on in evaluation. In the field, it was very, very rare to find something with the sand shields actually fitted. But because the track is wider than that of the VVSS, they have had to add this extra guard with angle protectors to hold it in place, and they make actually a pretty good mounting point for getting up and down with your feet as you're climbing in and out of the tank. Overall, HVSS was almost exclusively on the 76 tanks. There were 2 exceptions. One was the 105 millimeter, and a lot of those were equipped with HVSS, and the other were 500 built by Fisher with a 75 millimeter, and they were mainly sent to the Pacific because they didn't need the extra punch of the 76 millimeter gun, but they really appreciated the better suspension. So this is why you can immediately yell at somebody who automatically just says 76 HVSS, it's an easy 8, because that eliminates the possibility of the 75 HVSS, which is also an easy 8. You just don't talk about it. Otherwise, again, more applique armor, some logs, which were of dubious utility except for emotional support. Track blocks mounted on the side. This was an official place for mounting the spare track blocks. These are late model Chevron rubber track. Very common post-war, not least also because as time progressed, metalled or tarmac-adamant roads became much more common, and these provided you a little bit more grip onto things. And then you get to the engine deck, under which you will find the 2 diesel engines. 6046 being a twin diesel implies that you get twin exhaust ports, and sure enough, they're both located back here. What we have here are the exhaust deflectors, and they basically make sure that the exhaust doesn't come down and bring up a whole lot of dirt and other signature to let everybody know you're coming. However, the problem with these is that they're now in the way of your track tensioning. So in order to tension your track, which of course you must do routinely, you have to unbolt the connecting bar, which is holding the exhaust deflector in place, swing that up and out of the way, if not off entirely, and then you can attack. It's the same tensioning system on M4 based vehicles you've seen elsewhere. It's just a massive nut that you have a wrench that comes way out to here, and you pure leverage. And low and center is the mounting point for a tow hook. Now, again, you rarely saw a tank towing anything, although the 105 version of the tank often would be seen with an ammunition trailer behind it. And you also have 2 mounts for some recovery clevises or simple tie-down points for rail movement. Apparently, one has snapped off, and it makes you wonder how much force was being hauled in order to get this pretty thick piece of metal to snap off. But they managed it. You never know with a bunch of privates what they'll manage to break. I mean, let's say if you give a private a rock and a hammer, and 20 minutes later you come back to it, somehow he's broken the hammer and the rock is still in one piece. Believe it or not, this rack back here was not originally intended to hold ammo, water, and fuel. It is instead the folding blanket rack, and it would be where you would place your blankets. What a surprise. There are actually little holes underneath here also for the ramming staff, which would ordinarily be mounted on the back. but it will fold up out of the way. By use of this, you'll see little tie-down points underneath so you can strap your blankets in place. Whether or not you actually want to have your blanket at the back, I think is another matter entirely, because you're going to get the exhaust, you're going to get all the dust and so on your blankets. I think it was a very silly idea, and they probably were better off just to put something a little bit more metal on the back instead. So having a quick look at a VVSS with slightly less mud on it. It's actually been fairly good weather around here, but they do spray the running track with water in order to keep the dust down, so that the audience do not get covered in dust, but unfortunately it doesn't help the running gear stay clean. But you can see the VVSS springs are mounted opposite each other. So the narrow end is forward in this particular one, and the far side, the inside one, is to the rear. So what will happen, of course, is you got your pivot point here. Wheel will come up, it will compress actually against both of them at the same time, because the back stop for the one is the front stop for the other, with the shock absorber here, and that's how you get your suspension effect. So this comes in and out whilst these move up and down. All right, moving forward, just quickly, you see the wear gauge on the sprockets. So this is something that we even have today. There's a little indent that shows the allowable wear. So eventually what's going to happen is, with enough running, these sprocket teeth will wear down to the edge of the wear gauge. It's a bit like the wear gauge on the tire of your car. When it gets down to nothing, unbolt the sprocket itself from the wheel, turn it over, and so now you're wearing on the other side of the same teeth. So you get double the mileage out of the one sprocket. Simple system, still in use. While we're here, we also get a good view of the next of the major modification programs, the turret and gun. This is the EZ6. So the idea of the M4 needing a bigger gun to engage enemy tanks actually predates the M4. And it is the reason why the M3 75mm was selected over the M2 75mm found on the earlier M3s. They realized German tanks were getting tough. And it was also realized that, well, they will probably continue to get tougher, so we need a higher velocity cannon to deal with it. So in 1942, the program was well underway to equip the M4 with a high velocity gun. Now, the first thought was to use the 3-inch. Unfortunately, the 3-inch is just far too heavy to fit into the tank. The M10, the tank destroyer, they could do it, but not on a proper turreted tank. Eventually, however, a 76mm gun was developed, which fired exactly the same projectile with the same ballistic properties, but the gun only weighed half the weight. Fantastic. They put that into an M4 turret, and it works. Ordnance decrees, yes, this gun does exactly what we want it to, and they tell Army Ground Forces go, fantastic, we'll take 1,000 of them in time for the invasion of North Africa. Now remember, at this time, it's just Panzer IVs is all the worst that's out there that they knew about. However, they didn't ask the users. Different topic, goes over the armored force for testing. They decide it just doesn't work. It's too unergonomic. The sights aren't accurate enough, and go back, try again. So they went back to try again, and I had to think about it. And the program took a bit of a pause, because at this point, Ordnance is working on the T20 series, particularly the T23, which is a 76mm tank, low profile, electric drive, all singing, all dancing, best thing since sliced bread. And so good that the Army orders 250 of them into production, and there's not really any desire to upgun the M4 for a little bit. Well, it turns out the T23 wasn't actually the best thing since sliced bread, but the turret was good, and it had the same turret ring size as the M4. So they decided, well, what would happen if we put the T23 turret onto an M4? And then the EZ6 program really took off. It was selected for production in September after testing in August 43. And by January 44, 76mm turrets started being placed in production. They eventually made it to Europe by July of 44, another long story. As is common with a lot of tanks, in order to open up the engine deck, you spin the turret to the right, and that was very nice. I decided not to put wear and tear on a museum vehicle without need, so I hand cranked it, which in fairness actually isn't all that bad in this tank. But anyway, underneath, the GM6046 is technically an 850 cubic inch twin inline 6-cylinder compression engine water cooled. Puts out 410 horsepower, about 1100 foot-pounds of torque. And being a twin diesel, it's fairly fuel efficient, fairly reliable. It's fairly popular amongst its export users. US Army never liked to use it. It just didn't have the horsepower of the gasoline engines, and frankly, they didn't want the additional fuel type. Now, immediately the M10 comes to mind as an exception, but there you go. Also used briefly by the Marine Corps, but that was not a matter of the fuel type. That was simply a matter of, we want M4s right now. What's available on the production line? Diesels. Okay, we'll take it and we'll replace them with petrol engines or gasoline in American later on. And you can see the three big air filters per side. These are basically two 6-71 engines side by side, connected at the front with a transfer case. There's a clutch on each engine. The transfer case then leads to the single power shaft, which goes forward into the standard transmissions. So as I say, three large air filters per side. You've got a fuel filter up the front there. And I mean, it's reliable, fuel efficient. Export users liked it. Again, these are two separate engines. So there's two lubrication points. There's two water for coolant points and two fuel points. And they are all helpfully labeled: water, lubrication, and fuel on the far side. About 178 gallons of fuel, 28 gallons of oil. And the one thing that is on one side but not the other is the fuel filler port for the auxiliary engine. So the little Joe provides power without running the big diesels. That is still gasoline. Okay, that'll about do it for part one. It's hot, we need to drink some water, and so we'll be back in a week or two for part two. I'll hope to talk to you then. God damn it, you piece of crap. I've used up so much of my credibility on you.